Snow fell thick over Dry Creek, muting the sound of the world, as though the town itself were holding its breath. The blacksmith sat alone in his shop, the air heavy with the smell of iron and ash. His pipe hung cold between his lips, the embers in the fireplace almost dead. For years, nights like these had been nothing but silence, silence that reminded him of all he had lost. The war had taken his son, and with him, the last thread of warmth in the blacksmith's life. That silence shattered with a knock. It was sharp, hurried, echoing against the heavy oak door. The blacksmith's shoulders stiffened. Visitors did not come at midnight, not in this weather. He glanced at the poker beside the hearth, grabbed it instinctively. Another knock followed, harder, almost desperate. "Who's there?" His voice was gravel, carrying both suspicion and loneliness. For a moment, only the storm answered. Then, through the howl of wind, came a fragile voice. "Please, help." The blacksmith's jaw clenched. He debated ignoring it, letting the storm swallow whoever it was. But the plea had been too weak, too human. Against his better judgment, he unlatched the door. Snow burst in as he pulled it open. A boy stood there, no older than 12 or 13. He was trembling from head to toe, his coat too thin to guard against the storm. Frost clung to his lashes, his lips were cracked and blue, and his knees buckled as if every ounce of strength had drained from him. "Please, sir," the boy whispered. "Just for tonight, somewhere warm." The blacksmith hesitated, suspicion gnawing at him. Strangers meant trouble. Yet when the boy sagged forward, nearly collapsing onto the threshold, instinct moved faster than thought. He reached out, seized the boy's arm, and pulled him inside. "Sit by the fire," he ordered, shutting the door against the storm's roar. The boy stumbled toward the hearth, crouching low to the faint embers. His shivers rattled the room. The blacksmith tossed kindling onto the coals, coaxing reluctant flames to life. Light grew slowly, painting the boy's face in flickering orange. Thin, exhausted, half-starved, his eyes darted nervously, as though expecting to be thrown back into the storm. "Where are you from?" the blacksmith asked, voice low. The boy didn't answer. He pressed his hands closer to the fire, lost in its fragile warmth. It was then the blacksmith saw them. The boots. His breath caught in his chest. They were worn, scuffed from years of use, but unmistakable. The stitching pattern, the curved soles, he recognized the craftsmanship. His craftsmanship. These were boots he had forged long ago, designed to fit a boy's narrow feet. Not just any boy, his son. But his son was gone. The poker trembled in his grip. His eyes fixed on the boots, unwilling to believe yet unable to deny. Questions tore through his mind. How had this stranger come to wear them? What tie could exist between this boy and the grave he had mourned for years? The boy finally looked up, meeting his stare. In the firelight, the blacksmith glimpsed something unsettlingly familiar. Not the exact face of his son, but a shadow of it. A memory, an echo, reflected in younger eyes. "Thank you," the boy murmured. His voice was raw, fragile, but sincere. The blacksmith said nothing. He stood rigid, heart pounding like hammer strikes against an anvil. Outside, the storm buried the boy's tracks. Inside, a mystery began to burn hotter than any forge flame. The fire had grown stronger, snapping at the kindling, painting restless shadows on the stone walls of the forge. The boy sat huddled close, his thin arms wrapped around his knees, while the blacksmith leaned against the workbench, arms folded across his chest. The warmth seeped slowly into the room, but it did little to soften the tension between them. For a long while, the only sound was the crackle of flames and the boy's uneven breathing. The blacksmith watched him with a sharp eye, measuring every twitch, every movement. Strangers rarely arrived in Dry Creek, and never by accident. Especially not during a storm that would have buried a man twice the boy's size. "What's your name?" the blacksmith asked at last, his voice flat, the question more command than kindness. The boy hesitated. His lips parted as though to speak, but then he shut them again, gaze dropping to the boots on his feet. Those boots. The blacksmith couldn't look at them without feeling something twist inside his chest. The boy must have noticed, because he tucked his legs tighter under him, as though hiding them. The blacksmith's jaw tightened. "You didn't walk in here wearing boots you bought off some merchant." "Those are mine. I made them." The boy's shoulders stiffened. He looked toward the fire, avoiding the man's stare, but still he said nothing. The silence stretched thin, heavy with unspoken truths. The blacksmith's mind raced. Had someone stolen his son's belongings and passed them along? Had this boy found them abandoned in some forgotten chest? Or was it something darker? The boy's stomach growled, breaking the tension with a sound both pitiful and human. With a grunt, the blacksmith turned to the cupboard, retrieving a half loaf of bread and a strip of dried meat. He set them on the table with more force than necessary. "Eat." The boy looked up cautiously, then shuffled to the table, his movements timid, wary. He picked at the bread like a creature too hungry to resist but too nervous to trust. The blacksmith watched him chew, still silent, still guarded. Finally, he muttered, "You lost?" The boy swallowed, nodding faintly. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, little more than a whisper. "Been walking a long time." "From where?" Another pause. The boy's eyes flicked up to meet his, and in that flicker there was both fear and defiance. "Don't remember." It was a lie, the blacksmith knew. He had lived long enough, hammered truth and falsehood on the same anvil, to hear the ring of dishonesty. Yet he didn't push, not yet. Instead, he studied him in silence. Thin frame, hollow cheeks, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Yet beneath that weakness, there was something sharp, an edge, like steel not yet forged. The firelight danced across the boy's face, and for one dizzying moment, the blacksmith saw his son there, not in form, but in spirit. The set of the jaw, the stubbornness in the eyes. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the stranger. "Why my door?" he asked finally. The boy looked back to the fire, shoulders curling in. "Just knocked," he whispered. The blacksmith grunted, unconvinced, but let the words hang. He didn't press further, though the questions gnawed at him. Instead, he picked up the hammer lying on the bench, turning it in his hands, letting the weight anchor him. The boy finished the bread, crumbs dusting his fingers, and leaned back in the chair. His eyelids drooped, heavy with exhaustion. For a fleeting second, he looked less like a mystery and more like what he was. A child, half broken by cold and hunger. The blacksmith sighed, setting the hammer aside. "You can sleep here tonight. But come dawn, I'll have answers. You hear me?" The boy nodded faintly, already drifting, too tired to resist. Within minutes, he was asleep, head resting on the table, breath slow and steady. The blacksmith remained awake, staring into the fire. His eyes drifted again to the boots. Memories rose unbidden. His son's laughter in this very forge, the sound of hammer against steel as they worked side by side, the proud day he'd finished those very boots. And then, the letter, the funeral, the silence that followed. Now the silence was broken. And the blacksmith knew, with a certainty that set his teeth on edge, that the boy asleep at his table carried answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted solved. The storm outside raged on through the night, but inside the forge, the air had settled into a tense quiet. The boy slept at the table, curled against the hard wood, while the blacksmith lingered near the fire, staring at the flames as if they might speak. His thoughts turned restless, circling the same questions over and over. How had this boy found his way here? Why did he wear boots that should have been buried with his son? The hours dragged. The blacksmith dozed in his chair, but every sound of the wind dragged him back awake. When dawn finally cracked faint light through the shutters, he rose and set a kettle on the fire. The smell of boiling coffee soon filled the room, sharp and grounding. The boy stirred, blinking against the morning glow. He sat up slowly, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and glanced at the blacksmith with a wariness that hadn't faded with rest. "You're awake," the blacksmith muttered, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. He slid it across the table, followed by a heel of bread. "Eat, then you'll talk." The boy obeyed, chewing quietly, as though weighing whether words or silence would serve him better. The blacksmith's gaze never left him, heavy as an anvil. At last, between bites, the boy spoke. "I didn't mean trouble. You found it anyway," the blacksmith said. His eyes flicked to the boots again, then back to the boy's face. "Where'd you get those?" The boy froze, crust of bread halfway to his mouth. He looked down at his feet as though seeing them for the first time. "They were given to me." "By who?" The boy hesitated, then murmured a name. It slipped out like a ghost carried on the air, soft, uncertain, but unmistakable. The blacksmith's heart clenched. It was a name he hadn't heard spoken in years. The name of his son's closest companion from the war. A boy who had marched beside him, bled beside him, and vanished from the battlefield the same day the blacksmith's son was carried home in a coffin. The mug of coffee trembled in the blacksmith's hand. He set it down hard to keep from spilling. Say it again. The boy looked up, confusion flickering across his young face, but he repeated the name. The sound of it filled the forge, and suddenly the blacksmith was no longer standing in the warmth of his fire. He was back in the field of memory, mud, smoke, the distant crack of rifles. His son and that friend walking away together, their figures swallowed by the fog of war. Only one returned, and even then, not alive. How do you know that name? The blacksmith demanded, voice rough with a mixture of dread and hope he didn't dare admit. The boy shifted in his chair, eyes darting. He told me to find you. The blacksmith's breath caught. The words hung in the air like a hammer suspended before the strike. Told you? When? The boy's voice dropped to a whisper. Before he died. The blacksmith sank back, his heart pounding. He searched the boy's face for deceit, but found only exhaustion, sorrow, and something else. Truth, perhaps, twisted through fear. Why me? He pressed. The boy looked at the boots again, then back at the man across from him. Because he said, you'd know what to do. Silence pressed down on them, heavier than the snow piling on the rooftops outside. The blacksmith's chest ached with memories he had long buried, with questions that had never found answers. Now, staring at this fragile stranger in his forge, he felt the past stirring to life again, demanding to be faced. The storm outside was easing, but inside, a different storm had only just begun. By the time the storm cleared, the boy had grown accustomed to the glow of the forge. He no longer sat curled by the hearth like a stray dog. He moved about the workshop, careful but curious, brushing his fingers across the heavy tongs, the horseshoes waiting to be shaped, the worn hammers lined on the wall. The blacksmith watched him closely, always wary, but he did not drive him away. Something about the boy's silence reminded him of iron, rough in appearance, but with strength hidden inside, waiting for fire and force to reveal it. Don't touch what you don't understand, the blacksmith warned when the boy lingered too close to the anvil. The boy flinched back. Sorry. The blacksmith grunted, returning to the bellows. He pumped until the coals glowed white hot, then set a bar of iron into the flames. The hiss and crackle filled the shop, the smell of heat and metal overpowering. He waited until the iron pulsed with light, then drew it out with tongs and placed it on the anvil. His hammer rose, fell, struck with a ringing rhythm that shook the rafters. Sparks leapt into the air like tiny suns. The boy stood transfixed. His wide eyes followed every swing, every burst of light, as if witnessing magic. The blacksmith noticed. Between strikes, he muttered, ever held a hammer before? The boy shook his head. The blacksmith grunted again. He drove the bar into shape, then quenched it in the trough, steam rising in a sharp hiss. He set the cooled piece aside, then turned, picking up a smaller hammer. He held it out. The boy blinked, hesitant. Take it, the blacksmith said. You got 2 hands, don't you? Let's see what they're worth. The boy stepped forward, cautious, and accepted the tool. Its weight surprised him. His arms trembled slightly as he lifted it. The blacksmith placed a small scrap of heated iron on the anvil, steadying it with tongs. Strike, he instructed. The boy swallowed hard. He raised the hammer and brought it down. The sound rang sharp, the blow clumsy but earnest. Sparks flew, and for the first time, a flicker of pride crossed the boy's face. Again, the blacksmith ordered. The boy struck again, this time firmer. Then again, and again, each swing steadier, guided by instinct more than knowledge. The blacksmith studied him, the rhythm building, the firelight reflecting in the boy's determined eyes. There was rawness there, but also something frighteningly familiar, an echo of another boy who had once stood at this very anvil. That's enough, the blacksmith said abruptly, taking the hammer from him. The boy's shoulders slumped, sweat already dampening his brow. But his gaze held steady, silently asking for approval. The blacksmith didn't offer it. Instead, he placed the hammer back on the wall and turned to stoke the fire. Still, something inside him stirred, a memory of his son's first day at the forge, of the awkward strikes that had grown into confident blows. As dusk settled, the boy sat at the table with another scrap of bread, while the blacksmith leaned against the doorframe, pipe unlit between his teeth. Outside, neighbors passed along the snow-packed road, some pausing to glance toward the glow of the forge. Their gazes lingered longer than usual, eyes narrowing at the unfamiliar figure inside. Whispers would follow, the blacksmith knew. Dry Creek was a place where nothing stayed secret for long. But for now, he let them whisper. The boy was here, under his roof, and with each passing moment, the line between suspicion and reluctant trust blurred. The fire burned steady, and in the quiet rhythm of the forge, the first fragile sparks of something new began to glow, something that felt dangerously close to belonging. In the days that followed, the boy became a shadow in the forge. He moved quietly, fetching water, sweeping ash from the floor, stacking wood for the fire. He never complained, though his small frame trembled under every load. The blacksmith said little, but he didn't send the boy away either. Their rhythm settled into something that resembled routine. The blacksmith at his anvil, the boy hovering nearby, observing every motion with sharp eyes. One evening, as dusk bled into night, the blacksmith set a stew pot on the hearth. The smell of onions and beef filled the room, earthy and warm. He ladled the food into a single bowl, intending to eat alone as always, but when he turned, he saw the boy watching, hunger plain on his face. With a gruff sigh, the blacksmith grabbed another bowl from the shelf, chipped and mismatched, and filled it. He set it on the table with more force than necessary. "Eat." The boy's eyes widened, then softened with something close to gratitude. He slid onto the bench opposite the blacksmith. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the scrape of spoons echoed in the small room. The blacksmith had long grown used to the silence of meals, but this silence was different. It wasn't empty, it was cautious, like two men testing the ground before a bridge. The boy kept his head down, but occasionally his gaze flicked up, curious, uncertain. Finally, the blacksmith broke the quiet. "You plan on staying quiet forever?" The boy hesitated, spoon pausing halfway. His lips pressed together, then parted. "I don't talk much," he said softly. The blacksmith grunted. "Figured that." They ate in silence again, but a small shift had occurred. The boy had answered. That alone was enough to chip at the wall between them. After the meal, the blacksmith leaned back, pipe in hand. The boy lingered at the table, as if reluctant to leave the warmth. The blacksmith studied him, the hollow cheeks, the wary eyes, the way his hands fidgeted with the edge of the bowl. Something in the boy's manner gnawed at him, something too familiar to ignore. "You remind me of someone," the blacksmith said at last. The boy's gaze snapped up. "Who?" The blacksmith didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the boots. "Someone I lost a long time ago." The boy looked down quickly, shoulders tensing, as if the boots burned his feet. The blacksmith's suspicion sharpened, but he held his tongue. Pressing now would yield nothing. He had learned enough from years of hammer and fire. Some truths required patience, time, and heat. That night, when the boy curled up on the cot in the corner, the blacksmith remained awake, staring at the flickering fire. He thought of his neighbors, men and women who already whispered about the boy's presence. In Dry Creek, gossip spread faster than wildfire. By tomorrow, the saloon would be buzzing with theories. Who was the boy? Why was he at the forge? And why did the old blacksmith, who had lived alone since tragedy struck, suddenly have company? He exhaled smoke from his unlit pipe, shaking his head. Let them talk. The boy was under his roof now. That was all that mattered, for tonight. But beneath the surface, unease gnawed at him. The boy had found a place at his table, yes. Yet he brought with him questions buried deep in the blacksmith's past, questions that would not stay silent forever. And the blacksmith knew. One day soon, the town's whispers would demand answers he might not be ready to give. The first blizzard of the season rolled in without warning. By nightfall, the wind screamed against the shutters, rattling them like bones, and snow piled knee-deep at the door. Travel was impossible. Even the saloon had closed early. Dry Creek vanished beneath a white veil, leaving the forge and its two occupants stranded in silence. The blacksmith was no stranger to winters, but this storm carried a weight he felt in his bones. The fire had to be fed constantly to keep the room from freezing. Wood cracked and spat sparks, filling the air with a bitter smoke that clung to every corner. He worked the bellows, coaxing flames into a steady roar, while the boy sat cross-legged nearby, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "You'll learn to do this too," the blacksmith muttered, nodding at the fire. "Forge doesn't care if it's storming. Iron won't wait." The boy looked up, eyes wide in the flicker of light. He nodded, though no words came. By the third day of confinement, silence had grown unbearable. They had eaten the last of the stew, surviving now on bread crusts and salted pork. The blacksmith's patience thinned, not just from hunger but from the gnawing questions that refused to leave his mind. The boots. The name whispered days ago. The uncanny way the boy had swung the hammer, as though his hands remembered work they had never done. "Tell me the truth," the blacksmith said one evening, his voice cutting through the howl of the storm. "Who gave you those boots?" The boy froze. His shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. He didn't answer at once. Instead, he stared into the fire, its glow reflected in his uneasy eyes. "I told you," he whispered at last. "They were given to me." "By who?" The boy hesitated. His fingers picked nervously at the seam of his coat. "A man said he knew you." The blacksmith's chest tightened. "What man?" The boy's lips pressed together. His silence spoke louder than any words. The blacksmith slammed his mug onto the table, the sound echoing through the small room. The boy flinched, drawing his knees to his chest, but still, he said nothing more. The storm raged on, pressing them closer together, and slowly, something shifted. The boy began to speak, not of the boots, not of the man, but of smaller things. He asked how the anvil was made, why the fire hissed when iron touched water, why the blacksmith's tools were heavier than they looked. His questions came shyly at first, then steadily, as if curiosity had finally cracked the shell of fear. The blacksmith answered gruffly, though against his will. Pride crept into his tone. He showed the boy how to hold the tongs, how to strike with the hammer without wasting strength. The boy listened intently, his face lighting when sparks flew, his grin fleeting but real. One night, as the storm reached its peak, the blacksmith found the boy asleep near the forge, curled beside the dying coals as though afraid to let the fire go out. The sight stirred something long buried in him, something dangerously close to tenderness. He draped a blanket over the boy's shoulders, grumbling at himself for the softness. The days blurred into nights, and by the time the storm broke, a fragile bond had formed, shaped not by truth, but by necessity, like two pieces of iron fused under fire. Trust, the blacksmith realized, was not something he had intended to give. Yet here it was, taking root in the heart of winter, as stubborn and unyielding as the forge itself. But even as that trust grew, so did the questions. And he knew the storm had only delayed the reckoning that would come. The storm finally broke, leaving the town of Dry Creek wrapped in silence again. But this silence was different, strained, expectant. Snow lay piled against fences, tracks disappeared overnight, and the streets remained empty except for a few bundled figures trudging toward the saloon. At the forge, the blacksmith lit the fire at dawn as he always had, but his eyes kept straying to the boy, who sat polishing a horseshoe with small, careful movements. The blacksmith had reached his limit. Days of half-truths and evasions gnawed at him. The storm had bound them together, but it had also given him time to watch, to study, and to realize the boy carried more secrets than he could count. "Come here," he ordered, voice firm. The boy looked up, startled, then set the horseshoe aside and walked toward the anvil. His small hands were smudged with soot, his boots leaving wet prints on the floorboards. The blacksmith pointed at the boots. "Put them up here." The boy froze. "What? On the anvil?" Now, reluctantly, the boy climbed onto the stool and placed one foot, then the other, on the flat surface of the anvil. The blacksmith leaned in, inspecting every seam, every stitch. His calloused fingers traced the worn leather, the familiar indentations that spoke of years of use. His throat tightened. "I made these," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I made them for my son." The boy's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. The blacksmith straightened, his jaw set. "So tell me, boy, where did you get them? Don't give me lies." "Not anymore." The boy's lips trembled. He looked away, staring at the fire, then at the door, as if escape might still be possible. At last, he whispered, "They were given to me." "By who?" The blacksmith's tone sharpened, like a hammer striking too hard. The boy swallowed, his hands clenched into fists. "A man," he said, "he knew your son." The blacksmith's heart lurched. For a moment, he felt the room tilt, the air heavy with ghosts. His son's name pressed at the edge of his throat, but he forced it down. "What man? Where?" The boy shook his head, tears pricking at his eyes. I can't say." Frustration boiled in the blacksmith's chest. He slammed his fist against the anvil, the sound ringing through the workshop like thunder. The boy flinched, nearly losing his balance on the stool. "You'll say it," the blacksmith growled. "You'll tell me the truth before long." The boy slid his feet off the anvil, stepping back, shoulders trembling. Yet in his eyes, beneath the fear, was defiance. The blacksmith saw it clearly now. This was no ordinary child stumbling into his door by accident. He carried something tied to the past, something that had been buried with his son. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the steady crackle of the forge fire, the breath of heat filling the room. Finally, the blacksmith exhaled heavily, the anger draining into weariness. "You'll stay. For now. But understand this, boy, truth doesn't stay buried. Not in this town, not in this forge. When the time comes, it'll come hard. And you'd better be ready." The boy lowered his gaze, silent, but the blacksmith noticed his jaw tighten, the faintest sign of resolve. The boots remained where they had always been, ordinary leather, scuffed and worn. Yet now they felt like evidence, like a question the blacksmith could not escape. Every strike of the hammer, every hiss of the quench, every whisper of the wind seemed to echo the same thought. Those boots belonged to his son. And the boy wearing them carried an answer that could break the silence of Dry Creek forever. The first thaw of winter brought more than melting snow. It brought eyes. Neighbors who had once passed the forge without thought now lingered longer, whispering about the boy who carried himself like he belonged to no one and yet wore boots too fine, too personal, to be chance. The blacksmith ignored their stares, but inside he knew. Silence could only hold so long. The knock came on a gray afternoon, heavy and deliberate. Not frantic, like the boy's desperate plea weeks ago, but measured, like a man who expected the door to open. The blacksmith set down his hammer and wiped his hands on a rag. The boy froze at the sound, his eyes flicking toward the door with something between fear and recognition. "Stay here," the blacksmith muttered, though he suspected the boy wouldn't move regardless. When he pulled open the door, the cold air rushed in, and with it, a man. Tall, broad, shoulders hunched beneath a weathered coat. His face was scarred, a jagged line splitting his cheek, another above his brow. His eyes were pale and hard, like ice that never melted. "Afternoon," the man said. His voice carried the low rasp of someone who had smoked or shouted too long in life. "Heard you've been keeping company." The blacksmith's jaw tightened. "Depends who's asking." The man stepped across the threshold without waiting for permission. His boots thudded on the wooden floor. When his gaze landed on the boy, he smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There you are," the man drawled. "Knew you'd end up here." The boy shrank back against the workbench, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge. The blacksmith stepped between them. "State your business." The man's smile thinned. He reached into his coat, and for a moment the blacksmith's hand flew toward the hammer at his belt. But the man pulled out only a folded paper, yellowed and creased. He tossed it onto the anvil. "That's my business." The blacksmith unfolded the paper. His gut tightened. It was a letter of guardianship, legal-looking, stamped with the sheriff's seal, though old and worn. Scrawled across it was the boy's name. "He belongs to me," the stranger said. "Been looking for him. He ran, took something that wasn't his." The boy shook his head violently. "He's lying." His voice cracked, raw with panic. "I don't belong to him." The blacksmith studied the paper again. The handwriting on the signature line was familiar. Not the stranger's hand, but someone else's. He couldn't place it, but it tugged at memory like a half-forgotten dream. "You expect me to believe this?" the blacksmith asked, voice low. The stranger's pale eyes narrowed. "Believe what you like. The law will believe the sheriff's seal. You keep him here, you'll be breaking it." The blacksmith's fingers curled around the letter, crumpling its edges. Every instinct told him this man was dangerous, but danger wrapped in legality was harder to fight. He glanced back at the boy, whose eyes pleaded silently, desperate for protection. "Get out," the blacksmith said. The stranger's smile returned, cold and sharp. "I'll be back, and when I come, I'll bring the sheriff with me." He turned and left, the door slamming in his wake. The forge fell silent again, but this silence was not the old companion the blacksmith knew. This was the silence of a fuse burning, of a storm gathering. He set the crumpled paper down on the anvil, staring at the seal that promised trouble. The boy's voice broke it, small and trembling. "Please, don't let him take me." The blacksmith looked at him, at the boots, at the fire that never seemed to die. And though questions clawed at him, one truth rang clear. The past had come knocking again, and it would not leave quietly. The stranger's visit hung in the air long after he was gone, like smoke that clung to the lungs. The blacksmith kept the crumpled guardianship letter on the anvil, reading it over and over, searching for flaws in the seal, cracks in the handwriting, anything that might reveal it as false. But the more he studied it, the more unease gripped him. The boy paced near the fire, restless as a cornered colt. He forged it, the boy muttered. I know he did. He lies about everything. The blacksmith grunted, not looking up. Maybe. But the sheriff doesn't care much for lies when there's a seal stamped on paper. The boy's fists clenched. His lips pressed thin, as though he wanted to speak but couldn't. His silence only sharpened the blacksmith's suspicions. That night, when the boy finally fell into uneasy sleep, the blacksmith searched the small satchel he carried. He hadn't meant to invade the boy's belongings, but desperation outweighed pride. Inside were a few scraps of cloth, a dull pocket knife, and a bundle of papers tied with fraying string. Most were blank, scraps salvaged from somewhere. But one piece caught his eye, a fragment, charred at the edges as though rescued from fire. He unfolded it carefully, the paper brittle and fragile. The ink was blurred, but enough remained to send a jolt through him. The handwriting, he knew it instantly. The loops, the heavy strokes, it was his son's. The blacksmith sat hard on the stool, staring at the words that refused to vanish even as the ink faded. If this reaches you, trust only the forge. The fragment ended there, the rest eaten away by flame. His breath came ragged. His son had written this. Not years ago, not before the war, recently. Or so it seemed. But how? His son was dead, his body buried, his boots long gone. Yet here was a letter burned but alive in the boy's satchel. He turned it over in his calloused hands, searching for sense. None came. Where did you get this? He demanded when the boy stirred awake. The boy blinked, eyes wide at the sight of the letter in the blacksmith's grip. His face went pale. I don't know. It was given to me. By who? The boy's gaze darted toward the door, as though expecting the scarred stranger to appear again. His silence was an answer of its own. The blacksmith slammed the paper down on the table, the charred edges scattering ash across the wood. Don't toy with me, boy. This is my son's hand. I'd stake my forge on it. You tell me where it came from, or so help me. Tears welled in the boy's eyes, but still he refused. Instead, he whispered, all I know is, he wanted you to see it. The blacksmith's anger faltered, replaced with something heavier. The boy's voice carried a conviction that was not rehearsed, not convenient. It was too raw, too desperate. He looked again at the letter, the words etched into his mind. Trust only the forge. What had his son meant? What danger had he seen fit to warn against, even from beyond the grave? And how had this boy, this stranger, become the messenger? The fire hissed in the hearth, ash drifting into the air. The blacksmith realized with a chill that whatever answers the boy carried, they were tied not only to the scarred man who had knocked at his door, but to his son's past. And the past, he knew, had claws sharp enough to tear the present apart. Word traveled fast in Dry Creek. By the next morning, the saloon was buzzing with talk of the scarred stranger and the boy at the forge. By noon, the sheriff himself arrived. Sheriff Amos Grady was not a man to waste words. He was tall, with a gut hardened more by whiskey than work, and eyes that had seen too many disputes turn bloody. When he stepped into the forge, the air shifted. Even the fire seemed to shrink back. The blacksmith set down his hammer slowly. The boy froze in the corner, his small frame tense. Morning, Eli, the sheriff said, using the blacksmith's name with the kind of familiarity that wasn't friendly. Heard you've taken in company. The blacksmith didn't answer. The sheriff glanced at the boy, then back at the man before him. Stranger came to me last night. Claims the boy's his. Brought papers. Looked official enough. They're false, the blacksmith said flatly. The sheriff shrugged. Maybe not. Ain't my place to argue signatures and seals. My place is to keep the peace. The blacksmith crossed his arms. And dragging a child back to a man like that keeps peace? The sheriff's jaw worked as he chewed on the thought. He spat into the fire, where the saliva hissed. Law don't bend easy, Eli. You know that, but I'm giving you time. A week, 7 days. You prove the boy doesn't belong to that man, or I'll have no choice but to hand him over. The words dropped like hammer blows. The boy's eyes went wide, his breath catching. The blacksmith's own pulse thundered. And if I don't? The sheriff's gaze hardened. Then you'll be standing in the way of the law. And I reckon you don't want that fight. The blacksmith said nothing. His fists tightened at his sides, the urge to strike rising hot in his chest. But the sheriff wasn't the kind of man to intimidate. Finally, the sheriff turned to leave. At the door, he paused. One more thing. Stranger says the boy stole something from him. Didn't say what, but if that's true, it won't just be guardianship. It'll be theft. You're protecting him now, Eli. Means you're tied to whatever trouble follows. And with that, the sheriff stepped into the daylight, boots crunching on snow. The forge fell into silence once more. The boy slumped onto the bench, face pale. He'll take me, he whispered. The blacksmith stared at the door, rage simmering. Not if I can help it. The boy's gaze lifted, searching his face. Why? You don't even know me. The blacksmith looked back at him, at the boots, at the ashes of the letters still scattered on the table. No, he said quietly. But I know lies when I hear them. And I know those boots didn't walk here by accident. The boy swallowed hard, a flicker of relief mixing with fear. For the blacksmith, the ultimatum had carved a line in the sand. 7 days. 7 days to uncover truth from lies, to understand the meaning of his son's words, and to decide whether trust could outweigh suspicion. The fire hissed as he stoked it higher. The forge would burn day and night if need be. Because the truth, whatever it was, would have to be hammered out before the week was done. The days after the sheriff's visit passed like molten iron, slow, heavy, and dangerous to touch. The blacksmith threw himself into his work, pounding steel until sparks filled the forge, but no amount of noise could drown out the ticking clock in his head. 7 days. That was all he had before the law returned. The boy lingered close, helping where he could, but his movements carried a nervous energy, as though every creak of the door made him flinch. At night, he hardly slept, his eyes darting toward the windows, expecting the scarred man's pale gaze to appear at any moment. On the 5th night, the storm returned. Wind rattled the shutters and snow hissed against the glass. The blacksmith worked late, hammer ringing out against the anvil while the boy fed the fire. The steady rhythm calmed him, until it broke. A noise cut through the wind. Not the sound of storm or snow, but wood splintering. The blacksmith froze. The boy's eyes went wide. Another crack followed, louder, sharper, like a door forced against its frame. Stay behind me, the blacksmith hissed, grabbing the heavy hammer from the bench. The back door burst open. Cold air and snow swept in, and with it, shadowed figures. At least 2 men, maybe 3, slipping through the dark, their boots crunching on the stone floor. The blacksmith swung the hammer, striking the first figure squarely in the chest. The man staggered back with a grunt, but another rushed in, grabbing at the boy. The boy screamed, twisting free just as the fire roared from the bellows' sudden burst. Chaos filled the forge. Shouts, the clang of iron, the hiss of burning coals scattered across the floor. The blacksmith fought like a man possessed, his hammer an extension of his arm, each strike fueled by fury and fear. The boy darted between shadows, desperately trying to stay out of reach. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The intruders fled into the storm, leaving only wreckage in their wake. The forge was a mess, tools scattered, wood splintered, and worst of all, the fire dead. The hearth lay cold, ashes smothered by snow blown in from the door. The blacksmith stood panting, chest heaving, hammer heavy in his hand. The boy clung to the wall, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Are you hurt?" the blacksmith demanded. The boy shook his head, but his voice cracked. "They tried to take me." The blacksmith's jaw clenched. He looked at the cold forge, at the lifeless coals. For the first time in years, his fire was gone, not by his hand, but by another's. It felt like more than sabotage, it felt like desecration. When he turned back, the boy was gone. Panic surged. He ran into the storm, shouting the boy's name, but the wind swallowed his voice. Snow blinded him, erased tracks as fast as they were made. The boy had vanished into the night, as suddenly as he had arrived weeks ago. The blacksmith staggered back inside, gripping the edge of the anvil, breath ragged. The forge was silent, colder than it had ever been. He stared at the boots still resting by the hearth, abandoned in haste. His son's boots. The past had come for him, and now it had taken the boy. And with the forge dark, he knew this was no longer just about a stranger at his door. It was about truth, buried deep in ash and lies. Truth that would demand to be found, no matter the cost. The forge stood silent, colder than a grave. Snow blew through the splintered back door, blanketing the floor where the fire had once roared. The blacksmith sat slumped at the workbench until dawn, boots heavy with ash, staring at the empty corner where the boy used to sleep. The boots the boy had left behind lay beside the hearth, mute reminders of a truth that refused to die. When morning light finally broke, the blacksmith rose. He strapped on his coat, slung the hammer at his belt, and stepped into the blinding snow. The town of Dry Creek still slept, windows shuttered, unaware of the storm that had blown through the forge. But out there, somewhere in the hills, the boy was running, and the blacksmith would not let him run alone. The snow was deep, but not deep enough to hide the boy's tracks. Small footprints cut across the drifts, weaving through alleys, across frozen fields, toward the line of pines that marked the edge of town. The blacksmith followed, each step sinking heavy, his breath clouding in the cold air. With every footprint, memories surfaced. His son's laughter echoing in the forge, the proud day he'd fitted him with those very boots, the letter that had arrived months later, wrapped in black ribbon. He had buried the body, buried the grief, buried the silence. But the boy had unearthed it all, simply by knocking on his door. The tracks led out of town, toward the hills. Crows circled overhead, their cries harsh in the still morning. The blacksmith gripped his hammer tighter. Each step forward was not just pursuit, it was reckoning. By midday, the snow grew deeper, the wind sharper. The boy's tracks wavered, zigzagging as though exhaustion had dragged at his legs. The blacksmith pressed on, heart pounding, lungs burning, his eyes fixed on the trail. Somewhere ahead, the boy stumbled alone through the wilderness, hunted not just by strangers, but by ghosts of the past. At a ridge, the tracks veered sharply toward a narrow gorge. The blacksmith stopped, scanning the horizon. The land here was treacherous, sheer cliffs, ice-covered rocks, and rushing water frozen mid-flow. He squinted at the prints, noticing something new: they were not alone. Larger footprints had joined them, boots heavier, strides longer. The scarred man. The blacksmith's stomach clenched. The boy had not simply fled, he was being chased. Rage lit through him, burning hotter than any forge fire. He quickened his pace, following the trail down the slope, careful but relentless. His boots crunched through snow, his hammer swung at his side, and in his chest, the old ache of grief had sharpened into something else entirely: purpose. At the base of the gorge, he paused. The tracks led straight onto the ice, across the frozen river that split the canyon in two. The blacksmith's breath misted before him, clouding his vision. Somewhere ahead, danger waited. He tested the ice with his boot. It groaned but held. He stepped forward. The boy was out there, trapped between a scarred past and a merciless pursuer. And the blacksmith knew, as surely as he knew the weight of the hammer in his hand, that this journey would not end with silence. It would end with truth. The snow whispered around him, covering his trail as he crossed the frozen river. He didn't care. There was no turning back now. The gorge was a jagged scar in the earth, its walls of stone rising steep and unforgiving. The river below had frozen into a mirror of cracked glass, stretching from bank to bank. The boy's tracks led straight onto it, smaller prints staggering in uneven lines. Larger, heavier boot marks followed close behind. The blacksmith's gut twisted. This wasn't a flight, it was a chase. He stepped carefully onto the ice, the hammer at his belt clinking against his thigh. The surface groaned under his weight, spiderweb cracks spreading out like veins of blue light. Every step was a gamble, but he pressed forward, eyes locked on the trail ahead. Halfway across, a sound carried on the wind, a cry. High, desperate, echoing off the gorge walls. The boy. The blacksmith broke into a stride, his boots striking the ice in heavy thuds. The cracks deepened, water shifting beneath, but he didn't slow. He rounded a bend where the gorge narrowed, and there he saw them. The boy stood on the far bank, pressed against the rocky wall, his face pale with fear. Before him loomed the scarred man, his broad figure blocking escape. The stranger's hand clamped around the boy's arm, holding him in place. "You can't run forever," the man snarled, his voice carrying easily over the frozen river. "You've got what's mine, and I'll take you back one way or another." The boy struggled, eyes darting wildly until they found the blacksmith. Relief flickered across his face. "Eli," he shouted, the name torn from him like a prayer. The blacksmith's chest tightened at the sound. He hadn't heard anyone call his name like that in years. The scarred man turned, his cold eyes narrowing. "So the old smith thinks he can play hero." He yanked the boy closer, pulling a knife from his coat. Its blade glinted in the weak sunlight. "Come closer and I'll cut away your reason for following." The blacksmith gripped his hammer, his knuckles white. "Let him go," he said, his voice carrying the weight of iron. The man laughed, harsh and cruel. "You think he's yours? He ain't. He's mine. Got papers to prove it. Sheriff'll back me. But I don't need law when I've got a blade." He pressed the knife against the boy's shoulder. The boy whimpered but didn't cry out. The blacksmith stepped closer, the ice groaning beneath him. His voice stayed steady. "You're lying. Those papers were forged. The boots prove more than any seal." The man sneered. "Boots don't mean nothing. You can forge a lie same as steel." The blacksmith's eyes locked on the boy's. In them, he saw terror, but also something else. Resolve. The boy's lips moved, whispering words only he could hear. "Tell him." The blacksmith took another step, the ice splintering loudly. "Then tell me this," he said, his voice a growl. "How'd the boy get a letter written by my son's own hand?" "A letter burned, hidden, carried here?" The scarred man faltered for just a breath. The knife wavered. That pause was enough. The boy twisted violently, stomping hard on the man's boot. The stranger cursed, loosening his grip. In that instant, the blacksmith charged. The ice cracked like thunder beneath his boots, but he didn't care. He closed the distance, hammer raised. The scarred man shoved the boy aside and swung the knife, but the blacksmith's hammer struck his arm with a bone-crunching blow. The blade clattered to the ice. The man roared, stumbling back. The blacksmith planted himself between him and the boy, chest heaving, hammer ready for another strike. The ice shuddered under their weight, a warning groan that echoed through the gorge. All three froze, knowing one wrong move could plunge them into the frozen depths below. And in that fragile balance, truth teetered, waiting to be spoken or shattered. The gorge held its breath. Beneath their boots, the ice trembled, spiderweb cracks spreading with each movement. The scarred man clutched his broken arm, snarling through clenched teeth. The boy huddled behind the blacksmith, wide-eyed, torn between fear and trust. The blacksmith kept his hammer raised. His voice was steady, iron-hard. "It ends here. No law, no forged papers, no blades. Just truth." The scarred man spat into the snow. "Truth?" His laugh was bitter. "Truth is, I took him because he was useful. The boots were mine to sell, the letter mine to burn. He's nothing but a runaway with scraps in his pocket." But the boy's voice rang out, trembling yet defiant. "That's a lie. He never owned me. I ran because of what I found, what your son wanted hidden." The blacksmith's heart clenched. He turned slightly, his gaze on the boy. "Say it." The boy's small hands tightened into fists. "Before he died, your son, he wrote letters. He hid them. I found them in the ashes of a burned camp. They said to come here. To find you. To give you the truth he couldn't carry." The scarred man cursed, lunging forward despite his injury. The blacksmith swung the hammer, striking the ice in front of him. The surface shattered, sending a spray of shards into the air. Water surged beneath, black and freezing. The scarred man staggered back, slipping on the slick surface, arms flailing. With a final cry, he crashed through the fractured ice, the river swallowing him whole. The current dragged him under, his shouts muffled by the rushing water until there was nothing left but silence. The gorge echoed with the sound of cracking ice, then stillness. The boy trembled, clutching the blacksmith's coat. The old man lowered his hammer slowly, his breath heaving in great clouds of steam. "It's over," he muttered. "For now." Together they crossed to the far bank, each step cautious on the groaning ice. When they reached solid ground, the blacksmith finally turned to the boy. His face was stern, but his voice carried something gentler than before. "You've carried this weight too long. Show me everything you found." The boy nodded, fumbling with his satchel. He drew out the charred scraps, unfolding them with care. Words faded by flame were still visible, lines that spoke of betrayal, warnings of men who would twist law for their own gain, and a plea written in a dying hand. "Trust only the forge. Tell my father the truth." The blacksmith read the words again and again, his vision blurring. He sank to one knee, the hammer slipping from his grip, and pressed a hand to the boy's shoulder. "You brought him back to me," he whispered. "Not in flesh but in truth. That's more than I ever thought I'd have." The boy's eyes glistened. "I thought you'd send me away." The blacksmith shook his head. "Not anymore. You're here, and so long as this forge burns, you'll have a place at my table." Spring came slowly to Dry Creek. Snow melted into streams, fields thawed, and green returned to the hills. In the forge, the fire roared anew, brighter than it had in years. The blacksmith worked beside the boy, guiding his strikes, teaching him the rhythm of iron and flame. Neighbors still whispered, of course. But whispers mattered little. What mattered was the sound of hammers ringing in unison, the glow of sparks dancing in the dark, and the knowledge that a bond forged in winter could not be broken. The boy was no longer just a stranger at his door. He was the keeper of a truth, the bearer of a legacy, and perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of a new tomorrow. And as the blacksmith raised his hammer high, he felt something he had thought lost forever: hope.